What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the video. I know it's been about a week since I last posted, but per your guys' request, what I am going to be doing today is a subscribers form critique video. And the format of each of these videos, because I want to do them semi-regularly, is I'm going to review 5 lifters videos at a time. And what I'm going to do is go through each of them individually, kind of first watch them, then talk about what I see, talk about advice, talk about, how this lifter can improve upon what they're doing, and maybe answer the questions that came along with the videos and try to troubleshoot why they're dealing with the problems they're dealing with. And the reason I only want to do 5 is, first of all, it would take forever to just burn through, the entire week's submissions, but also I think it has a opposite effect of what you would intuitively expect by going through fewer videos more individually. I think the more time you spend going through a lifter's individual problems and really talking about the lift, I think it's going to benefit a lot of the people watching whose videos obviously aren't being reviewed. We all are different, but we all are human beings with the same skeletons, the same muscles, and on average, we are going to run into pretty much the same types of problems, right? There are going to be patterns that you might observe in some of the lifters I review that you're gonna say, oh, I kind of deal with the same thing. And if I spend time really digging into the whys, I spend time digging into how to fix, I think that a lot more people will benefit outside of the person whose video I'm reviewing. I have my Utopia here. I'm gonna down it right now. This is the peach mango flavor from De Novo Subs. Delicious. Use code Nori. That's a shameless plug for the video. But seriously, this stuff for doing work is phenomenal. Tunnel vision it's just, you get so zoned in on what you're doing. But anyway, back to the video. I'm gonna be reviewing 5 of these lifters videos, and we'll see what we can find. So without further ado, I'm gonna get into reviewing these videos. First, I'm gonna get into my official video review costume. All right, we are back. We are ready to go. Okay. So our first submission is from Andrew. He says, hey Sean, hoping you can check out my squat. Been struggling with it in general recently. Also, I get a super intense low back pump from squatting, and I'm wondering if that's a technique issue. So, without even watching this, I probably know with fairly high confidence what your squat is going to look like if it's giving you a lower back pump. I'm sure some of you watching probably also kind of know where I'm going with this. Before watching his video, I am going to suspect that he is dealing with a very extended pelvic position. The rib cage is also super extended, and there is this disjoint relationship between those two structures, and that is contributing to this lower back pump, and probably feelings of it just being technically off. So, all right, we're gonna watch this video. Okay, yep, so Andrew, my hypothesis was correct, and I'm happy to say this because I think this is a very manageable fix. We know exactly what the issue is, and I'm sure there are a lot of you watching who have had squats in the past that have looked like this, or you have dealt with squatting discomfort or the lower back pumps that Andrew is referring to, and have fixed it up under the guidance of a coach or a source of information that has helped you address this issue. So, what are we seeing here? So, when I watch you squat, Andrew, you are trying to create this very upright, strong position when you squat. You're really trying to show off that chest. You're trying to keep that upper back tight. You're trying to make sure you don't fold over. Now, Extension patterns are really useful for human beings because we fight gravity from being able to fall over. And initially in our lifting career, right, we are trying to not collapse under the weight of a bar. And obviously, extension and flexion and abduction, adduction, internal, external rotation, right? Nothing is bad. We need all of it, right? But the issue becomes when we feed a pattern and reinforce it and reward it too frequently underneath load. Because the more load we're subjected to, the more reinforced and learned the patterns become. So I would like to address this now, nip it in the butt, and hopefully we can get you squatting properly. So what we're seeing here, right, is an overly anteriorly rotated pelvis and an overly protracted rib cage while squatting. So like I said, you really try to get this chest up and get it out. You're trying to keep that lower back from rounding. And as a result of this, you are creating a lot more extension at the pelvis than is necessary for you to be able to lift properly. Now, the pelvis is essentially the center of our body, where it's the junction between our upper body and our lower body, right? And in order for the pelvis to rotate, muscles on either side of that pelvis, both front to back and top to bottom, have to take certain actions. They have to contract or lengthen in a specific way in order to get the range of motion of the pelvis that we desire. So in your case while squatting, what's happening is by creating too much of an anterior pelvic tilt, which is essentially arching that low back really hard, there is going to be certain muscle lengthening and shortening that happens to create this specific position. Now, for an anterior pelvic tilt, when the pelvis rotates forward more, what we get is we get a lengthening of the hamstrings, but as a result, on the opposite side of the pelvis up top, we get a really strong shortening of the erectors and the lower back muscles. And we don't want those muscles to be acting as these prime movers. We don't want them really shortened. Their job during our squat is to stabilize our thorax. We really don't want this super tight, high tone, super short low back while squatting, because ultimately it's not those muscles' jobs. Now you can also see higher up what's happening is you're really trying to shove that chest out. You're really trying to shorten those lats, okay, on the back side to try to create this tightness. And then what happens on the front side is the abs and obliques get overly lengthened, right? Think about trying to flex your abs if your rib cage is tilted up like this. You can't do it, right? The abs and obliques to flex pull the rib cage down. So we have this lengthening of certain muscles that we don't need and shortening of muscles that we don't need shortened. So the reason that you're dealing with this low back pump while squatting is you're just using your lower back too much. And it is not an issue that only arises during the squat. You kind of set yourself up for this failure before you even initiate the squat, right? So you're super driven out with that rib cage. You're super extended in the low back and the pelvis, and the lower back takes over, lower back muscles take over. Those lats are really taking over, trying to create stability at the thorax. And that's not what we want, right? So what we want to try to do, what I'm gonna do is now put on the screen a video of my buddy Corey Greenberg squatting, and then a video of my buddy Connor Borkert squatting. And what you're gonna see with both of these squats is that these guys do a good job of retracting the rib cage. So instead of trying to drive the chest out, taking it back, using the abs and obliques to keep the rib cage both rotated down and over our midfoot so it's not driven out past our toes. Another thing that they do really well is at the top of the squat, you'll notice that they really flex the hamstrings and glutes to rotate the pelvis out of an anterior tilt and keep it directly underneath them. And you'll notice while they squat, they're really focusing on holding that brace. They're focusing on keeping their weight over the midfoot, and they're not letting that lower back take over, trying to drive extension during the descent of the squat. They allow a natural level of hinge to happen, which is a result of letting the torso fall forward as the hips go back. And then they are creating space by driving the knees forward and actually loading the hips. So what you're dealing with this lower back pump probably also translates over to having a feeling of difficulty hitting depth, because as we descend in the squat, if we keep rotating our pelvis anteriorly harder and harder, it's going to be more difficult for that femur to translate into the back of the hip socket, which is going to make it harder for us to achieve true hip flexion. And that's why lifters who have super extended postures feel like they need to just lean forward more and more in order to reach depth, and oftentimes why they collapse in the bottom of the squat. So, Andrew, what we can do to address this is gain some context for what it means to establish this good relationship. Now, what I'm gonna do is put a video on the screen of, or rather a picture on the screen of a nice little graphic that I think Kabuki Strength has made. Now, don't quote me on that. It's gonna be up literally right now. Could be wrong, could be right, I don't remember. But what you're going to see is that they draw a parallel line from the bottom of the rib cage and they draw a parallel line from the top of the pelvis. And you'll notice that in order to maintain a good relationship between the rib cage and the pelvis, those two imaginary lines need to stay parallel, right? When they become disjoint in the way that you squat, what happens is that line from the bottom of the rib cage tilts up facing the sky in front of you, and that imaginary line at the pelvis tilts down facing the ground in front of you. So you'll notice as you squat, right, if I were to draw those imaginary lines, they become further and further away from parallel, closing off that outlet in the back, okay? Now, obviously the opposite we don't want either. We don't want it closed out in the front. You would probably see this in an older population who starts lifting, or a really young population who starts lifting who just doesn't have enough muscle and they collapse underneath the weight of the bar. So that's the first thing we want to establish, is that what that relationship is. Now, there are some drills that we can do to kind of help establish this context for you so that you can eventually carry it over to squatting properly. One of them is going to be a 90-90 Hemi Bridge. I've talked about this in my lower body warm-up video. Now, I think if you've never performed this before, it's going to have a lot of carryover for you, a lot of bang for your buck, because it's going to eliminate the threat of having a bar on your back, but give you the ability to really hone in on the context of what you're trying to achieve and get an understanding of, okay, these are the muscles I need to flex. This is how I have to breathe in order to control my rib cage and pelvis in the way that I need to squat properly. For those of you who are a little bit stronger watching this, the 90-90 certainly can help, but there are probably some higher level interventions that will need to take place in order to get the most out of carrying it over into your squat, especially since you are probably squatting heavier weight, right? The heavier the weight is, the stronger you are, the more deep-rooted a lot of these compensations became. On the exercise side of things, what we can do for you, Andrew, is on the competition specific side of things, aside from trying to implement a lot of the general cues that I'm talking about, we can do tempo squats. And we don't want to work with super heavy weight on these tempo squats at first, because what's going to happen is the heavier that you take your lifts, you are going to fall back into a lot of the strategies that are showing themselves on this top triple that you did here, because that's the way that your brain feels safe under heavy load, right? It doesn't want you to get hurt. It wants to do what feels strongest and most stable for your body, even if that's not necessarily the most efficient pattern. So we can do tempo squats, and what I want you to think about as I've discussed already with examples like Connor and Corey, is focusing on bringing your weight back over your heels. So feeling your heels really heavy, establishing good points of contact between the front and the back of the foot. I don't necessarily think you need to be thinking of 3 points of contact. I just really like thinking of a heavy heel and a heavy ball of the foot so that you can create a nice active arch in the foot. The next thing that you want to really focus on is kind of exhaling all your air out and feeling what it's like for that diaphragm to descend and consequently the rib cage to descend and pull down as a result of the abs and obliques flexing and as a result of exhalation. You'll kind of notice you have this more stacked feeling, right? You're not going to feel like your rib cage is way out in front of you. And then on the pelvis side of things, you really want to try to flex those hamstrings and glutes to kind of bring that pelvis just underneath you a little bit more. Obviously, we're not trying to round it, but we don't want it to be super extended. Now, from the grip side of things, your grip width looks okay, but what I will say is that you shouldn't be trying to shove your chest out super hard or create an overly tight shelf in the sense where it's sacrificing your rib cage position. Stacking that rib cage over that pelvis, really getting a good brace at the abs and obliques will take care of the stability of the bar that you're trying to create with the lats that you're trying to create by pinching excessively hard. So these tempo squats would be really useful, probably at first in like the 3 to 5 rep range, probably working anywhere between 70 and 75%. And really just trying to hammer away at holding that rib cage down with the abs, keeping that pelvis underneath you, allowing the knees to track forward and create that natural space for the hips. An exercise variation side of things, what we can do are safety squat bar squats, Zercher squats, front foot elevated split squats. You can do the front foot elevated split squats with an SSB. You can do them with a goblet stance with a dumbbell or a kettlebell. You could do it double kettlebell front rack position. All of these alternatives would be great. And they're going to help you reinforce this neutral position and help you really sit in between both feet and just load the hip really naturally without getting into these, nasty extension patterns. But yeah, overall, I don't see anything that tells me you have any sort of mobility restrictions. I don't think you need to be hammering away at any lacrosse ball work or any stretching or any of this, mobility stuff that some people would probably tell you to do. I think that a lot of the stuff that we discussed is just an ode to having more awareness of your positionings, doing exercises to reinforce the positioning and become more aware of it. One thing you could do on like the stretching side of things is just kind of like bring your knees to your chest, hug them, and just breathe really deeply into your back. Try to get more expansion along the back and kind of calm down the lower back, because I'm sure even when you're not squatting and you're not getting these lower back pumps, it probably feels tense and like it's trying to essentially do a job at all times, when in reality it doesn't have a job to do, at least a job that intensely. Right, so I think that you could probably calm down the lower back a little bit in your free time. But as far as the exercise side of things goes, pay attention to a lot of the cues that we discussed. Watch the examples that I gave. Look at the graphics that I gave. Practicing tempo squats with moderate load, Zerchers, SSBs, split squats. All of these things will help your cause. Along with on the kind of accessory side of things, you could be doing adductor side planks, you could be doing glute ham isometric bridges, even some hamstring curls would help really nicely with this. We just want to strengthen the muscles that are probably too lengthened and too quote unquote inactive during a squat like this that we're watching in front of us. But this is a really long talk, and I'm glad that you submitted this, Andrew. I hope this helps, and I think that there are probably a lot of people out there who are dealing with squats very similar to this, and I think that this will be really valuable for them. So thank you, Andrew. All right, guys, we're gonna move on to the next critique now, which is from our buddy Alex. Alex says, I'm a 66 kilo lifter and here is my flawed sumo. I'm slowly getting better, but I really just want to improve. Would love your constructive criticism. Thanks, Alex. No problem, first of all. All right, so we have this video ready. Dude's a sumo deadlifter right now. Okay, so this looks like a near max attempt. Pretty heavy single. This looks like 195. His max is probably, or 197. His max is probably somewhere like 202. But yeah, this is the perfect kind of video submission because all sorts of technical breakdown are more likely to happen at the heavier loads. So me seeing breakdown at like a heavy single or a low rep heavy set is really valuable. It's really telling. So the first thing that I notice here, Alex, is that you initiate the pull in a very slack position. So what I mean by slack is you don't have all of the tension removed from the system. And when I use the word system, that sounds really wishy-washy and whatever. But all of the individual areas we can consider part of the system are the relationship or the contact point between your hands and the bar, right? So that runs the length of where your arms attach in your shoulder sockets all the way down to where your hands are on the bar, right? So getting tension means getting all of that slack out of that specific area, right? So if I were to grab a barbell, I'm sure a bunch of you have probably heard about pulling the slack out of a bar, right? It's really taut. We have as much effective length in the arms as we possibly can. And you guys will notice as Alex initiates his pull, he kind of lets his arms bend a little bit and then he goes to pull. Now, this is a result of a bigger problem. Now, what I'm saying is that he does let his arms bend, but the arm bending is not the cause of this, inefficient sumo deadlift pattern. There are a couple things that I think are lending themselves to this, and as in most cases, issues result from a more proximal or central issue that manifest themselves distally and more, at further extremities, right? Everything usually originates from some central point. Now, that central point is going to be the pelvis, as well as how he expresses force into the ground prior to pulling. So I don't see in this video how you approach the bar, but from what I'm seeing here, it looks like you're pretty closed off from the bar in your hips. It looks like you are very close to the bar physically, like your shins are right up against it. And you're not expressing any actual force into the ground prior to pulling. And the reason I think that's so important, and I'm sure some of you have heard me talk about this before, is that you need to preload the floor with tension, okay? It's not only easier to do conventional, but it's just not as necessary because the position that you try to maintain on a conventional deadlift does not have as much frontal plane elements to it, right? When you pull conventional, your feet are directly underneath you, and the only real relationship you're trying to maintain at the pelvis is just keeping it from rounding underneath you, right? So you're dealing with this very simple, management issue on the conventional side of things. We're just trying to brace effectively so that the pelvis doesn't posteriorly rotate too much so that we don't round and lose the bar that way. But with the sumo deadlift, where the hips need to be opened up, where we need to keep that position that we established static and strong, there's a frontal plane element that comes into it. There's more strength at a higher demand mobility that is required. And the thing about maintaining a position under load is that there needs to be an active force expressed by the body in order to maintain it. Because if we have a weight on the bar, it's going to want to pull us out of whatever position we put ourselves into. In order for it to be a strong position, we can't just establish the position and All right, we're done. This position needs to be reinforced by some sort of structural stability or strength, which in our case is this preloading of the floor. So what I'm gonna say about preloading the floor is that our buddy Alex here needs to be pushing not just down, but out in the direction his toes are pointing as hard as he can before he even touches the bar. So before he's bent over grabbing the bar, trying to get ready to load, what he needs to do is, with his quads, is drive down into the ground. So he's gonna feel these quads super heavy. You're gonna feel your feet heavy as a result because you're pushing all that force in through the feet because that's your point of contact with the ground. You wanna be pushing down and in the direction your toes are pointing. So you wanna be pushing through the balls of the feet super, super, super hard. If your toes are at a 45, like they are in this case with Alex, he's gonna be pushing down into the ground and at a 45-degree angle super, super hard. He's gonna wanna keep those knees driving out over the toes. He's gonna wanna keep those hips high, but you wanna keep them close to the bar. All right, and as I just mentioned, knees staying over the toes. We don't wanna drive them excessively out because then that just puts us in this unnatural sumo position that is, one, not maintainable, and two, it's not strong, right? We want to have this element of a hinge to our sumo deadlift. A sumo deadlift is still a deadlift, which means it's still a hinge, which means we need to have our hips back as well. There's a fine line where we do want to keep our hips close to the bar, but we also don't want to just be opening up for the sake of opening up. So what Alex needs to do is he needs to preload the ground really, really hard and with lots of intent down and in the direction his toes are pointing. And he needs to establish both a hinge and then also some level of external rotation to make sure that he has his knees over his toes. The next thing that might help with him is, like I said, he has this really close to the bar setup where his shins are really up against it, but he's not really opened up to the bar yet. So for some lifters who struggle with opening up to the bar, I think it's counterproductive to set up super close to it. We do see a lot of really good sumo deadlifters set up as close to the bar as possible, but they have already opened up. They already have the requisite mobility. They already have the strength in that position such that they're able to maintain that level of opened upness when they initiate the pull. Whereas people who have more trouble opening up to the barbell, if they initiate the pull when they're too close to it, their knees kick in, their hips shoot back, which is exactly what we're seeing here with Alex. I mean, as soon as he initiates that pull, he goes from an okay looking, just from an outside observer's standpoint, an okay looking pull to just, I mean, the hips shoot back, the knees really close in, and it just becomes a really not so pretty deadlift, right? So we talked about preloading the ground. Now we're going to talk about rotating into the bar. So I'm going to put an example right now on the screen of my buddy Garrett Fear, and I'm going to use Garrett as an example of creating a lot of expansion in the back and creating a lot of effective length in the arms. So you guys will notice with Garrett's pull is that he's pulling on a deadlift bar. And even though he's on a deadlift bar, what he's doing is very applicable, to those of you pulling on a stiff bar. Now, what you'll notice that Garrett does when he loads into the bar is that he's maintaining that constant relationship between the pelvis and the rib cage, as we discussed in the last video. But what he's doing to create that hip pump and create that length and get that slack out is he is expanding through the back. He is driving that rib cage toward the ceiling, and he's getting a lot of expansion, a lot of protraction of the scapulas, retraction of the rib cage. And what that's doing is that's getting a lot of length in the arms. We want our arms, right, to be effectively as long as they can possibly be without sacrificing any sort of positioning at the pelvis, right? Why are deadlifters with long arms so good? It's because they're able to pull in a better position, right? If we have longer arms, we can have our hips in a better spot, a more mechanically advantageous spot to initiate the pull, right? So if we can make our arms effectively as long as possible, we are going to be in a much better position to pull. In addition, we are going to get all of the slack out of the bar in a much more meaningful way. Now, when it also comes to slack, right, we see two things happen with our buddy Alex here. The first thing being that he wasn't preloading the ground as we discussed, but he also squats into the bar as his way of rotating because he just doesn't have that concept of rotating. So you see what happens here, I'm gonna play through it really slowly, is his torso angle is almost parallel with the ground and his hips are kind of high. They're probably exactly where you would want them to be during a sumo deadlift. And instead of wedging, opening up, and rotating into the bar, what does he do? He just squats down further. So you'll notice he squats down into the bar, so his butt just kind of dumps underneath him. His torso angle doesn't really change, and since his torso angle is not changing in response to the lowering of his butt, mechanically what has to happen is his arms have to give way, right? So if his butt comes down and his torso moves with his butt, right, his arms are going to lose that slack because he is effectively closer to the bar, you know, in the wide direction, right, in the vertical plane. So the issue of his arms losing that slack isn't because he's not trying to pull the slack out from his arms. It's just that he can't. You can't pull your slack out from the arms if your torso is moving down with your hips as you are rotating into the bar. So he sits down and he kind of just yanks, and you see that bar drift away from him. And obviously, as many of you know with the sumo deadlift, if your starting position is off, that lockout is going to be rough, right? And that lockout is a struggle. So my advice is to preload that ground really hard, driving down and out in the direction your toes are pointing. Try to create more space off the bar, so don't be as close to it. I'm sure if you were to take any sumo deadlifter who is really, really close to the bar when they're pulling, they probably set up a little bit further back. It's just that when they rotate everything to position, it gets them closer to the bar. So give yourself a little bit of space. I'm sure that's going to help. And as you rotate, there's a really useful post by Yu Ren talking about this glass wall and wedging behind the barbell. And that doesn't mean to rock behind the bar. You actually want to try to rotate through the bar, but in order to keep your hips at this constant height, what you have to do is stop your torso at this glass wall. So what you want to do is you want to preload that ground, and when you grab the bar, try to get that expansion in the back that Garrett did so well. And then as you rotate the hips, you're going to get to a point where your hips can't open up anymore, and your butt shouldn't and can't really go any lower if you want to maintain that same level of opened upness to the bar. So what has to happen is you have to create that effect. You have to reinforce that effective length in the arms and drive that torso up in response to that hip movement, right? So if we look at this here, we could pretend this is your pelvis, we could pretend this is your head, right? And here's your low back. This actually works out really nice from a curvature standpoint, that this would be your pelvis, there's your lower back, right? If my hips need to rotate into the bar, right? If I want this to move as a rigid body, which obviously this fork is a rigid body, right? What a rigid body is, it means that, you know, it's a one connected piece where there are specified rules for how motion works for it. So what that means is, like, if this side rotates 10 degrees this way, right, for it to be a rigid body, this side has to rotate 10 degrees the opposite way, right? So if I'm picturing that this is my pelvis, right, and I'm about to rotate into the barbell, right, my torso has to respond in an equal and opposite way in terms of rotation. Now, that rotation is not going to be perfect, right? We're not going to, and probably shouldn't try to have, you know, for every 10 degrees of rotation at the pelvis, that we should get 10 degrees at the torso. But we want it to be closer to that than what we're seeing in this video, right? Because what we see from Alex is that as his pelvis rotates, as he's getting closer to the bar, it's not moving like a rigid body, right? Because you see his pelvis, it moves down, and then so does his torso. Everything is just translating down instead of rotating. So we want that rotation to get to a certain point and be matched by a torso rotation upward. So we want to preload that ground. rotate those hips, feel like we've loaded all that tension into the floor as much as we possibly can before we even pull, and lead that chest up from that high hip position, right? So we want to, as another final piece of advice or remark for Alex, is that preloading of tension. We should be at almost 100% of all the tension needed to lift the bar before we even pull. So we don't want to go from 0 to 100. We want to, with every bit that we rotate into the bar, add more and more force into the ground. We want to feel like we have already exerted all the force needed to lift the weight before we actually pull. It's just that the rotation into that final starting position is what gives us the green light to initiate the pull. So it shouldn't feel like I'm gonna rotate and then when I'm in position, I'm gonna exert all my force. It should be, I'm going to exert all my force, and then when I rotate into position, that's my green light to go, right? It's almost like we're opening a door for a bull. Like that bull is ready to go, it's revving up, it's probably already, dragging its feet in that sand, in that dirt. It's ready, right? And then when we let that door up, that gives it the green light to rush out, right? We're not running from the back of the barn and slamming into that wall to try to break it down, right? We are revving up that engine to the point where we're almost at the perfect starting position, 99%, 100%. Okay, I'm there, now I can pull. We're going from 99% to 100% as opposed to 0 to 100%. I hope that helps. I think that this is gonna help a lot of people with sumo deadlift. And it's for your video, Alex. We can thank you for that. So this was awesome. All right, I think I lied, guys. I spent a lot of time explaining these, and I think to make things more interesting, to put more demand on me, to put these out more regularly, I think I'm only gonna do 3 today, and I'm gonna finish it with a bench video. So our bench video comes from our friend Nate. Attaches video of bench. Whenever I go for heavy doubles or singles, I have trouble getting the bar off my chest, and I believe it may have to do with my elbows flaring. I have also had trouble with my butt coming off the bench. Any help you could provide would be greatly appreciated. So before I watch this video, he says he has trouble getting the bar off his chest, and I believe it may have to do with his elbows flaring. Now, when he says his elbows flaring, I'm going to assume that elbows flaring is referring to them flaring when he presses. Now, if your elbows are flaring in response to the press, I'm going to assume that something happened prior to the press that's causing that compensation to happen. So his logic may be a little bit reversed here, where the issue is not his elbows flaring, it's that why are his elbows responding in a way that seems excessive when he presses the bar off his chest. There's probably an issue going on before that that is leading to that response. So we always want to address the root cause. And he's also having trouble with his butt coming off the bench. So Nate, without further ado, we're gonna watch your bench video here. Okay, Nate, I think that there are a lot of things that we can tackle here in this set of 6. I know I said that it's better for me to see higher percentage sets, but there's a lot that I see going on here that I think is contributing to your issues that you may not know about, which is honestly a good thing. I think you should be very hopeful about this because the novel information that we're gonna discuss right now, I think will have a lot of carryover, because I think that you've probably been trying to essentially hammer away at this from the wrong angle, okay? So you mentioned you think it has to do with your elbows flaring. So if I watch your bench back again, what I'm seeing is a bar path on the way down that really kind of swims forward. You kind of have it drift forward on you. So you start the bar kind of over your nipple area, kind of the middle upper pec area. And then what I see you doing is the bar path kind of comes forward more, right? It needs to reach the point where you're going to touch, so it drifts forward. Now, the method you use to get it drifting forward more is you externally rotate at the humerus, probably too excessively. And this leads to you tucking your elbows too much. So you do want to have your elbows tucked insofar as they're keeping your elbows directly underneath the bar, but what we don't want is we don't want to touch excessively low, and we don't want our elbows out in front of the bar. So we never want our elbows out in front of the bar because that just leads to inefficient force transfer. But two, we don't want to tuck so much that even if our elbows are underneath the bar, that our touch point is just too low. So in your case, what I'm seeing is probably too much external rotation of the humerus. An external rotation of the humerus would be if I rotate my thumbs outward, right? So my shoulder rotating or deviating outward so that my thumbs rotate away from the center of my body, right? Internal rotation would be the humerus rotating toward the middle of my body. External would be rotating out. So what we probably need to do to help with this is get a little bit more internal rotation of the shoulder when you're bench pressing. So when you take that bar out, really try to drive that outer part of the hand out toward the bar a little bit more. And as a consequence, you'll have a little bit more internal rotation of the shoulder. Now, the pecs are going to be much stronger in that position. The pecs are responsible for internally rotating that humerus. It's a lot stronger pressing position. And I think that if you are able to establish a little bit more internal rotation early on, what we're going to see is that the bar is going to start a little bit more directly over your touching point. So you won't feel the impetus to tuck the elbows to try to drift that bar forward over that touching point. And then you won't have to be tucking your elbows, first of all, but two, you won't get this feeling of, oh, I'm flaring my elbows too much off the chest, because in reality, the amount of elbow flare you have off the chest is nowhere near excessive, right? Your elbows are probably flaring or drifting to that position because that's where they need to be in the first place, right? Your humerus wants to be in that position during the press, but you don't give it enough internal rotation at the start of the bench press and then during the eccentric for there to be any sort of leverage when you initiate the press. So your issue is not a result of your elbows flaring, it's that your elbows are flaring as a result of your issue. And the issue, as we mentioned, was that you have too much external rotation and you're tucking those elbows too much. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'm going to mention is that you're wearing a belt. And the reason I don't like bench pressers wearing a belt is that whether or not you are trying to create a ridiculous arch, we do want an arch on bench press, right? We want to pull our scaps back and retract them. We want to be able to internally rotate the shoulder. We want to be able to get this advantageous rib cage position so that we can drive that bar back, right? Now, what's the role of a belt? The role of a belt is to keep this neutral rib cage and pelvis position, right? We wear a belt when we squat and deadlift to keep our back from rounding. We wear a belt to keep kind of a static, strong, stacked position, right? So it's counterintuitive to wear a belt when you bench press, or it's counterproductive to wear a belt while you bench press because you're trying to create an arch. I mean, I see it. You've adopted this toes forward or feet forward position that I've spoken about. So clearly you are trying to get a good arch. But when you wear a belt, all the belt is doing is it's going to try to undo every bit of arch that you create, right? This belt is trying to bring you back to neutral and you're trying to get more of an extended position. So why do you see some lifters wear belts? Well, my first point is going to be that some lifters shouldn't be wearing belts, but we see some of the heavier weight lifters wear belts, right? We see the 120s, the 120 pluses wearing belts when they bench press. And the reason for this is that they have guts, they have bellies, right? Not only do they have bellies, but they're also less mobile than some of the lighter lifters. You'll notice that a lot of heavier lifters don't really arch that much, right? They don't create these massive, strong arches. So how do they get tension at the belly? How do they get tension at the touching point? How do they reduce their range of motion? They put on a belt that when they brace against, since they have so much actual tissue in that area, when they brace against that belt and they have a stomach, that brace puffs up that part of their stomach, right? It gets it harder, it gets it higher up toward the bar. So now they're essentially getting the same effect that an arch gives us smaller lifters from having a harder, more protruding stomach, right? So they lack the requisite mobility to create an arch, and that belt is giving them that artificial arch in order to have a stronger, more sturdy touching point, right? So they're cutting their losses. They know they can't create a lot of extension through the T-spine and lumbar spine. So what they do is use a belt to create that same effect. And you don't need that. Clearly, you're not a 120 or a 120 plus, right? You don't have a gut, you're a smaller lifter. Now, this also, wearing of a belt, could be contributing to your butt coming off the bench, right? Because you are not able to get as much lumbar extension or hip extension at the start of your bench press because that belt is restricting it. So since you don't have it at the start, you try to get it during the press, right? You don't have the amount of hip extension you need to stay in this strong position and apply the leg drive that you want. So what happens is when you press, you try to get more of it by driving through the ground. But since you don't have that hip extension, you get it and then your butt comes up. So if you eliminated that belt, you would probably be able to establish a little bit more of that lumbar extension, a little bit more hip extension, and you'd probably feel more comfortable keeping your leg drive constant during that eccentric because you're in a better position. Which brings me to the point of, I think that you need to keep your leg drive more constant. You should be pushing 100% of the time with 100% of your force when you are bench pressing. And that includes the unrack, that includes the eccentric. You should be pushing down and out as hard as you possibly can through the quads the entirety of the bench press. And we don't want to be squeezing the glutes. So do not drive those knees out. Do not flex the glutes. Flexing the glutes in that manner will kind of have the same effect as wearing that belt. It's going to bring that pelvis back underneath you if you're trying to squeeze and contract the glutes too much. So that's that. Yeah, push with the quads really hard. Ditch the belt so you can get more of that extension through the pelvis. And then the final thing that I'm noticing, and this can also be benefited by that constant leg drive, is your neck and your head. So the feeling of losing it off the chest could be a loss of tightness as a result of your weight distribution. So you'll notice, and I know this is really kind of hard to see for some of you at home, but there's a space that we see surface at the base of his neck and his cranium when he touches the chest, which tells me that he is not keeping enough pressure and not enough of his weight distributed on the back of his neck. So I've talked about this before. We want to keep a long neck when we bench press. We want to keep those traps pressed firmly into the bench. We want to keep the back of the neck pressed firmly into the bench. And we want to use our leg drive to get our weight distribution more on the back of the neck. And as we descend, we want to use our feet to drive that rib cage up and consequently get more of that weight going down onto the back of our neck. Combine the belt, taking him out of this advantageous arch with the external rotation of the shoulder, with the inconsistent leg drive, and it's no surprise that as the bar comes down, his center of mass shifts forward, right? Because if you were to view, Nate and the bar as one unique system, right? The center of mass of that system is going to be closer to his head when he's holding the bar in his hands because the bar, right, is closer to him. But then as he descends, the bar is drifting forward closer to the middle of his body, right? And when the bar touches his chest, it is at the closest to the middle of his body point that it's ever been, right? So the center of mass of that shift system shifts forward, right? So it's more likely that he is going to lose that pressure on the back of his neck, and consequently more likely to lose the bar at his chest or feel like he doesn't have that leverage, right? This is gonna happen to everybody, right? If we're holding the bar on the unrack and it's kind of over our face, that center of mass is closer to our face. But then as the bar comes down during the descent, if we touch low, then our center of mass shifts lower, right? So to combat that, that leg drive needs to be constant, and that rib drive, meaning driving that sternum up and back, needs to be constant. So as we descend, we need to be pushing down and away from us into the ground with our feet as hard as we possibly can, and driving that sternum up and pinching. So we're essentially trying to leverage ourselves backward to combat that bar's down and forward descent. And this is going to keep all the weight on the back of our neck. It's going to allow us to pinch and feel really in control of the bar when it touches our chest. And it's going to allow us to actually feel like we can press without losing control when the weight gets heavy. So that is my advice to you, Nate. I think you have a lot of things to work on, which is a good thing. And yeah, I think that you will come back with a way more polished and controlled bench after all this. I think that a lot of these things will feel very different, but I think you're going to feel way more in control, especially when you're underneath, you know, heavy doubles or singles, like you said. I know this is only 75% for you. So thank you for that, Nate. This was great. Yeah, that's where I'm gonna end today's video. So I think that's how we're gonna do it. I know I said 5, but I think 3 is a good way to do it, and to review a squat, a bench, and a deadlift every single time. This was a lot of fun. This Utopia, no joke, like when I started filming today, just like, you know, filming the intro without having drank Utopia, I couldn't even, you know, get out some coherent sentences. But after drinking this, I swear it is just, you're able to just ramble on, your thoughts come to you way quicker, you're really focused on the task at hand. And I have Ben and De Novo to thank for that. Seriously, it's a fantastic, fantastic company. Utopia is a phenomenal supplement, especially for those of you who have cognitive-based tasks or are very focused type lifters and don't just rely on the stimulation or the hype. Thank you all of the submissions. Obviously Andrew, Alex, and Nate were today's, but thank you to everybody who has submitted thus far. I hope that this was super helpful for all of you. I really enjoyed doing it. 1, to help you guys, and 2, because it just helps me become a better coach to be able to explain things like this on the fly. None of this was rehearsed. I hadn't watched any of these videos prior to just watching them now. So thank you guys for making me a better teacher, a better coach, and I hope that these critiques have made you 3 walk away with some valuable lessons that can hopefully make you better lifters. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe. Remember, there are no bad days, and I will see all of you in the next video. Take care, guys.